I'm diving into Plantman and Blondie, a dress-up gang film the way a creator who loves dissecting culture would, not as a recap, but as a fresh take that lives and breathes like a YouTube deep dive. Let's unpack what this movie tries to be, why it often doesn't land, and what the dress-up gang might do next if they lean into their strengths rather than stretched premises. I've got opinions, and yes, I'll argue them hard. Personally, I think the core question isn't whether something is weird or quirky, it's whether that weirdness is harnessed with a spine, a joke rhythm, and character through line. What makes this film interesting is the attempt to inflate a sketch realm conceit into feature length and see where the energy carries you. In my opinion, that leap reveals both the group's fearless appetite for offbeat bits and a structural strain that most short sketch success stories stumble over when they try to pad for time. First, the premise and its ambitions. Plantman and Blondie centers Corey Loikasek as a blonde, work-at-home employee who teams up with Donnie Divanian, a plant-loving cyclist who patrols the neighborhood like a green-thumb vigilante. The setup has a playful absurdity. Two odd-couple characters embedded in a cityscape where plant care becomes a misadventure magnet. One thing that immediately stands out is how the film leans into collecting gags around quirky obsessions. Gecko print shirts, super soaker weaponry, and a cast of eccentric side characters. What many people don't realize is that this kind of material works best as bite-sized vignettes with a punctuation mark at the end of each bit. When stretched, the punctuation becomes a long, awkward sentence that lumbers through the entire page. Why it's a hard sell as a feature. The humor relies on vibe more than narrative propulsion. You can feel the improv energy, the willingness to chase ridiculous tangents, but the connective tissue between ideas isn't strong enough to sustain 96 minutes. If you take a step back and think about it, the film resembles a string of sketches that forgot to tie themselves into a central hypothesis or character arc. This raises a deeper question. Can alt-comedy troupes translate the kinetic energy of sketches into a cohesive story without losing the spontaneity that defines their humor? Character dynamics that don't quite land. Corey's persona. An easygoing office worker who ends up chauffeuring Donnie around for a week. Could have been a fun pressure cooker for character growth. Instead, the plot meanders through episodic bits, and even the better acting feels like it's auditioning for a different movie. A detail I find fascinating is how the film leans into plant-themed subplots. Next Door Boys, water sommelier cameos, the plant heist angle, as if they're the scaffolding for a larger world. The issue is that scaffolding without purpose can become decorative rather than structural. In my perspective, the stronger version would have used the plant quest as a metaphor for care, control, and attachment in adulthood, then used the hijinks to illuminate the duo's evolving friendship, performances, and potential. The cast is clearly talented. Frankie Quinones, Corey Loikasek, and Donnie Divanian bring energy, and Kevin Nealon and Kate Berlant pop in with their own flavors. What this really suggests is that the material is almost a bones and muscle situation. The bones have potential, the muscles aren't quite firing in sync. A detail I find fascinating is how the film treats its cameos. It's less about their integration into the plot and more about their presence signaling the troupe's wider world. If the project could have tightened the anchor, perhaps a sharper through line about why Corey cares about Donnie's plant rescue mission, the performances could have carried the jokes further rather than merely filling time. Product placement as motif. The abundance of Chick-fil-A plugs feels like a real-time case study in brand integration in indie comedy. On one hand, it's a practical budget move. On the other, it becomes a meta-commentary on how indie films sometimes lean into pop culture saturation to try to mimic a bigger-scale energy. What this really suggests is that the movie is aware of its place in a crowded comedy landscape where even offbeat projects need recognizable touchpoints to survive marketing cycles. From a creator's lens, I'd argue the next step is to either lean into brand inclusion as part of the satire or prune it to reclaim narrative motion without the stopgaps that pull audiences out of the story. What the film reveals about alt-comedy cinema today. The dress-up gang represents a brave, unapologetic slice of comedy that thrives on idiosyncrasy and spontaneity. That's exciting because it pushes mainstream tastes by existing on its own terms. The lesson here, however, is that a successful feature length for a sketch troupe requires either a tighter spine, a strong personal conflict or pursuit that every gag serves, or a library of longer-running threads that can sustain the audience's curiosity. If you take a broader view, This project is less about a single movie and more about a testbed for how alt-comedy teams expand their canvas without losing the very thing that makes them distinctive: the sense of improvisational risk. Deeper takeaway and bigger trends. What this film hints at, in my view, is a growing tension in comedy between originality and durability. Audiences crave novelty, but they also want stakes that reward attention over time. The Dress Up Gang's ambition to stretch a sketch-based voice into a feature-length project points to a path many indie teams will navigate: how to preserve the raw energy of a short while knitting it into a narrative fabric that can sustain multiple viewing sessions. In that sense, Plantman and Blondie becomes less a standalone hit-or-miss film and more a data point about where the genre is headed, toward hybrids that balance quick-fire humor with more cohesive storytelling ambitions. Closing thoughts. If you're curious about how this movie fits into the broader arc of alt comedy, my takeaway is simple. The energy is real, the ideas are bold, and the execution felt like an early draft of something bigger. The people involved aren't out of ideas. They're learning how to translate that punchy, sketch-driven voice into a longer form without diluting what makes it compelling. So, what should come next? A follow-up that leans into a sharper mission statement, a clear goal for Corey and Donnie, tighter pacing, and maybe one or two longer-running gags that evolve. Or, a second feature that treats the duo's plant mission as a recurring motif, like a serialized caper, with episodes that build toward a more definite ending. Either way, I'm watching closely, because this is exactly the kind of experiment that could redefine how indie comedy scales up without losing its soul. What do you think is the right balance for a sketch troupe moving into features? Do you prefer more through-line or more bite-sized bits? Drop your thoughts below and tell me which moment in Plantman and Blondie stuck with you, and why.